The air inside the lecture hall at Caldwell University was thick not with anticipation or energy, but with something heavier. A silence that wasn't peaceful, but suffocating. The kind that lingers in a room where fear walks freely. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes with danger, but the kind that comes from intellectual dread. It was the fear of being singled out, of being humiliated in front of 200 pairs of eyes by the man who ruled this room like a courtroom, Professor Malcolm Stratton. Standing behind a grand, carved oak lectern, Professor Stratton scanned the hall like a general reviewing his troops. His gray hair was neatly parted, glasses perched low on the bridge of his nose, his tailored black suit immaculate. He was brilliant, no one disputed that, but brilliance alone didn't explain the icy silence that followed him everywhere. It was his cruelty, his ego, the way he seemed to delight in dissecting a student's confidence like a frog in a high school lab. And today, he was hungry. He liked his prey quiet, preferably new, ideally unprepared. Stratton's piercing eyes moved across the front row's faces filled with fear, respect, or both. Then his gaze slid further back, settling on a small figure halfway up the tiered seating. A young woman, hair tied back in a simple bun, sat with her head slightly lowered as she wrote swiftly into a neat notebook. She looked like she didn't belong. She was quiet, unassuming, lost in her notes. But Stratton didn't believe in invisibility. Not in his class. Her name was Mariel Cruz, a recent transfer from the Philippines. It was her third week at Caldwell. She hadn't spoken a word in class yet, hadn't missed a lecture either. She showed up early, sat quietly, wrote diligently. But to Professor Stratton, the quiet ones were never truly safe. His lips curled into the faintest smirk as he tapped his microphone, clearing his throat just loud enough to hush the room. "Miss Cruz," he called out, deliberately mispronouncing her last name with a drawn-out emphasis, twisting it ever so slightly into something foreign, something unfamiliar. A few heads turned. Mariel froze mid-sentence in her notebook and slowly looked up, pen still in hand. "Since you seem so absorbed in your notes," Stratton continued, voice dripping with mock courtesy, "perhaps you'd like to enlighten the class with your understanding of quantum entanglement? More specifically, the implications raised by the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen thought experiment concerning locality." Chapter 7, page 284, I believe. There were audible intakes of breath. Even the students who considered themselves competent looked uneasy. It was a setup. Everyone knew it. Mariel blinked once, then slowly straightened her seat. "Are you referring to the interpretation as originally stated in their 1935 paper?" she asked evenly, "or including the later considerations after Bell's theorem, which reframes the assumption of locality?" Stratton paused. It was subtle, but anyone paying attention saw a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. She'd thrown the question right back, clarifying, probing. That was not part of the script. He recovered quickly. "Let's keep it simple, Miss Cruz. The core paradox." Mariel nodded, and without looking at her notes, she spoke. "The EPR paradox suggests that entangled particles, even when separated by great distances, instantaneously affect each other's states upon measurement, thereby violating the principle of locality. That is, the idea that physical processes occurring at one location should not instantly influence outcomes at another, distant location. This appears to challenge the speed of light limit of information transfer as mandated by relativity." She paused, then added, "As stated in our textbook, page 284, second paragraph. If measurement on one entangled particle yield a result, the state of the other is determined instantaneously, regardless of distance." There was silence, then a wave of murmurs. Stratton's eyes narrowed. She hadn't just answered the question, she had dissected it, clarified it, and quoted it verbatim. The students sensed something. For the first time in a long time, Stratton looked, caught off guard, but his pride wouldn't let it go. "Let's move on then," he said coolly. "Let's discuss Dr. Arlen Veyron's 1998 publication on temporal causality loops. Specifically, the mechanism he proposed to resolve paradoxes like the grandfather paradox." I believe I mentioned it briefly 6 weeks ago. The room practically groaned. Veyron's paper was a notoriously dense theoretical proposal, mentioned in passing during a lecture tangent that had nothing to do with the syllabus. It was never assigned, never tested. And now, he was challenging her with it. Mariel looked down for a moment, her brow furrowed not in fear, but in focus. Then she looked up. In his 1998 paper titled Temporal Dynamics and Causality Correction, Dr. Veyron proposed that the universe naturally redirects causality through a probability distribution function that favors non-paradoxical timelines. In his analogy, he compared time to a stream and paradoxes to whirlpools that the current gently steers objects away from. Stratton's grip on the lectern tightened. She continued, quoting from the abstract, "Any timeline with self-contradictory events collapses into a zero-probability state under entropic favorability constraints, effectively nullifying paradoxes through probabilistic resistance." It was word for word. A stunned silence filled the room. Stratton's jaw twitched. His knuckles whitened against the polished wood. This wasn't just memory. This was intellectual dominance. And he knew it, but he wasn't done. Not yet. "If knowledge is all you possess, Miss Cruz," he said sharply, "let's test your reasoning. A thought experiment, if you will." He stepped forward. Imagine two isolated societies. One values absolute freedom, no rules, no regulation. The other functions under total control, complete order, but no personal liberty. You must eliminate one to ensure long-term stability for the entire region. Which society do you destroy and why? A few students winced. It was a cruel question. There was no correct answer. Either choice made you a villain. It wasn't a test of logic, it was a trap. Mariel was silent. Then she stood. "Professor," she said evenly, "your question presents a false dichotomy." Stratton narrowed his eyes. "You're asking me to choose between two extreme models, assuming they're the only possibilities. That is a logical fallacy. Furthermore, you're requesting an objective justification for an action elimination that is inherently subjective in moral reasoning and contingent upon definitions you did not provide." The room held its breath. "True critical thinking," she continued, "would begin by rejecting the constraints of the question itself. There are always alternatives: reform, negotiation, hybridization. To eliminate either society without exploring those options is not logic, it is tyranny disguised as intellectualism." A beat, then a whisper from the back. "Holy." She just flipped the table. Stratton's face turned red. He tried to speak, but nothing came out first. Finally, he sneered, "Well, concepts like nuance and logic aren't always taught the same way abroad. Some students are, given certain allowances." It was a subtle poison, a dig at her nationality, her status as a transfer student, an attempt to reduce her to an outsider. But Mariel didn't flinch. "My previous university ranked in the top 10 across Asia for theoretical physics," she said calmly. "I maintained a 4.0 GPA. I was accepted to Caldwell on a presidential merit scholarship and scored in the 99th percentile on entrance exams, including logic and ethical reasoning." She took a step forward. "And if that's not sufficient," she added, her voice like steel, "my IQ has been independently verified at 185. Gasps. Even Stratton froze. He tried to recover, but the silence had already turned against him. The room no longer feared him. They admired her. Then a student raised his hand not to ask Stratton, but to ask her, "Mariel, would you be willing to explain your breakdown of false dichotomy again?" That was incredible. Stratton's defeat was complete. He backed away from the lectern, face pale. "Class dismissed," he muttered, his voice barely audible, and fled the room as quickly as dignity would allow. Mariel remained, surrounded by classmates now gathering, thanking her, asking questions, seeking insight. She had not just survived the most feared professor at Caldwell. She had dismantled him calmly, brilliantly, and revealed the very system he used to intimidate as hollow. Over the next days, her name became legend on campus. The girl with the 185 IQ. The one who took down Stratton. Even the administration took notice. Professor Stratton disappeared for a week. When he returned, he was a shell of the man who once ruled the lecture hall with fear. Mariel never sought fame. She kept studying in the same quiet corners, still wearing plain jeans and sweatshirts. But now, classmates nodded respectfully when they passed her. Study groups invited her. Professors asked her thoughts, not just her attendance. And in the grand library of Caldwell University, where sunlight spilled over tall shelves of books, she sat one afternoon with a small group of struggling students. With a kind smile and soft voice, she guided them through quantum mechanics, showing that true brilliance is not in intimidation, but in clarity and care. In a world that often confuses arrogance with intelligence, Mariel Cruz had become something rare, proof that humility and genius are not opposites. They are often the same.